The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join my colleagues in this House tonight with a mixture of emotions in this critical debate on this profoundly disturbing subject. The first one is I stand in solidarity, with my colleagues on all sides of this place who find the events of April 14th and the weeks since abhorrent and repugnant. And we feel the need to do something. So I echo the sentiments of many of my colleagues tonight, because on April 14th, terror was struck in the hearts and minds of young girls, but also their families, with 100 to 300 young girls taken from a school in Nigeria, Mr. Speaker. Even that report is concerning because it took weeks to truly ascertain the number, and weeks alone for the government to come out in Nigeria and start talking publicly about this brash kidnapping and the snatching of girls and potentially their sale. The events are so abhorrent to any civilized society and any democracy, Mr. Speaker. It's also unfortunate that it took so long for the global community to become attuned to this act of profound terror. In fact, some commentators have said throughout April there was more time spent on a missing airline, that everyone knew the people on board could no longer be saved. There was more time and attention paid to that. And that puts it in perspective, Mr. Speaker. So I'm glad the member from Ottawa Centre and others tonight have put this on our national agenda where it should be. I also stand before you, Mr. Speaker, as a father to a young girl of 7 years old, Molly, the apple of my eye, and someone that I left at home before school this morning because I had to leave early to come to Ottawa. And the very principles of safety and security of our children is probably a common theme amongst parents from Canada to Nigeria, Mr. Speaker, and I can only empathize with the absolute terror that the families of these girls must be feeling, and the profound sense of impotence they have, not being able to provide that basic security to their children. It's also important to note, Mr. Speaker, that these girls were taken from a school. Their parents sought the best for them. They were pursuing the goals that really are universal human rights in this world, Mr. Speaker. And the fact that not only was their right of liberty stolen from them, the message being sent by Boko Haram was one of terror, not just in physical threat, but also to cast fear in those pursuing the best pursuits for their children, including our girls, Mr. Speaker. These are so fundamental to our principles as Canadians that they truly do shock us to our foundations. I also stand as a Member of Parliament in this place and proud that our government in Canada has joined with the US, the United Kingdom, France, and China, and other nations that have pledged support to the government of Nigeria to try and not only locate and bring these girls back to their homes, but to deal with Boko Haram, the group that took them, Mr. Speaker. As many members of this House have noted, our government immediately offered surveillance equipment in terms of helping to track this terror organization, Mr. Speaker. Beyond that, we also provided training and the operators to help bring that expertise to the ground immediately, so that our expertise, particularly on some of these things related to surveillance and intelligence gathering, could be instantly brought to bear on the ground in the country, Mr. Speaker, and I would say in bordering countries, because Boko Haram has also been a threat to Cameroon and Niger and the whole region. And we stand willing to work with our allies and with the government of Nigeria on that. We're also, it's good to note, Mr. Speaker, Canada has a strong relationship with Nigeria. We're the 10th largest donor to that country on a general annual basis, with $66 million in aid delivered in the last fiscal year to that country on a variety of fronts, including education, so that young girls like these that were snatched can pursue their full potential as young people in that country, but also in our worldwide fight to end child and early forced marriage, Mr. Speaker, because sadly these issues have been interspliced as these girls were taken and then forced into horrific relationships and unspeakable harm. It's also important, Mr. Speaker, to call out Boko Haram for what it is. It's a terror group that strikes at the basic fundamentals of our society. And we should pursue organizations like this with unrestrained vigor until they are eliminated. It is terror, Mr. Speaker. It's ironic that just on Friday, at our National Day of Honor, we paid tribute to the 40,000 men and women of the Canadian forces who spent time on the ground in Afghanistan. That was part of the initial war on terror, Mr. Speaker, after September 11th, when a failed state allowed al-Qaeda to train within it to a point that it struck, not just at Western values, like in this case in Nigeria, but at the Western world itself. And it's sad that sometimes it almost takes us to be shaken out of our complacency from the lovely distance we have from some of this terror sometimes. Here we've been thrust into it, and we should say for what it is that Boko Haram, which takes its name from the term forbidden. Haram means forbidden, and locals have called it Boko Haram because they feel that Western education is forbidden. That's sort of the roots of the term. So it's a perverse group that uses terror not just to strike fear, but to actually keep people in that country subjugated. It's terrible, Mr. Speaker. A group that's attributed 10,000 deaths to their activities in Nigeria and countries in the region. And Canada placed Boko Haram on our list of known terror organizations in 2013. And I do think it's important to reiterate, Mr. Speaker, that wherever there are groups such as these, Canada should play a role alongside our allies, and of course in this case working directly with the Nigerian government to make sure that these groups cannot operate with impunity, because as we have seen, this group from 2009 to today has escalated in their violence and in their acts of terror. Another interesting development, Mr. Speaker, is hashtag diplomacy, and I think some have suggested that it doesn't play a role, and it's really just raising awareness. But I think it's doing more than that, Mr. Speaker. From the First Lady of the United States to the Pope, the awareness has helped shake the complacency that sometimes sets in the Western world, thinking we're far removed from these gathering threats of terror that occupy developed or challenging states. And so hashtag diplomacy not only affects prominent people like popes and presidents, it also impacts people in my riding of Durham, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to compliment the students, the grade 7 and 8 students at the Good Shepherd Catholic School in Port Perry, who have asked to meet with me on this very subject, Mr. Speaker, to ask what Canada can do to help save our girls. So I think in some ways hashtag diplomacy seems so far removed from the terror that many Nigerian families are feeling. But if it raises this issue, much in the same way that my colleagues and I are debating this tonight, we will hopefully get to a state where groups like Boko Haram cannot operate in such fashion, because the global community will condemn the conduct. I also want to urge this House and people watching this debate to remember that tolerance and education are Canadian values, and I think it's appropriate to conclude with the remarks His Holiness the Aga Khan delivered in this House just a few months ago in February, Mr. Speaker, because it's important to show that Boko Haram has twisted a religious faith and does not represent the faith of Islam. He said in this place, "It has become commonplace for some of us to talk about an inevitable clash of the industrial West and Islamic civilizations. But Muslims don't see it this way. Those whose words and deeds feed into that point of view are a small and extreme minority. For most of us, it's simply not true. We find singular little in our theological interpretations that would clash with other faiths." He goes on to add, "Yet sadly, what is highly abnormal in the Islamic world gets mistaken for what is normal." Let's not mistake, Mr. Speaker, the abhorrent actions of Boko Haram as we move forward to shut down this terror group, and recognize that diversity, tolerance, and strength, Canadian values, should be global values, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Ottawa Centre.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank colleague for his comments. It was interesting, the different comments that we heard from around the world. He mentioned some very prominent people who spoke and used, as he said, the hashtag diplomacy, and by the way, I agree with him on his comments. There was a young girl who also spoke out, and the young girl who captured all of our imaginations, Malala, and she said very eloquently, simply, is that if we remain silent, then this will happen more and more and more. And I think she nailed it. I think that's really what we have to all speak out against, and to make sure that this doesn't happen again. I want to just ask my colleague a question just around what more we can do. One of the things that we have done in the past, and it actually was with Nigerian personnel, was in the AU-UN mission in Darfur. We trained Nigerians to help in that mission in Darfur, particularly around police training. And it's something that obviously the Nigerian government needs help with. I'm just wondering if he would think that would be, knowing his background, something we could help with. And secondly, just where he believes Canada should be in terms of the Global Education Fund. We have asked that our government, his party, support the ongoing commitment to global partnership in education, and to the tune of $30 million for the...
Order. The Honourable Parliament Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his comments. Certainly, as someone that served in the Canadian Forces, the initial reaction as a father and a former military person is send in the Special Forces, send in JTF2. We need to get these girls back. But that's the gut reaction, Mr. Speaker. We have to work with Nigeria to see how Canada can offer our assistance best, recognizing the sovereign territory of that country, and trying to work with them and our partners in the U.S. and the United Kingdom on giving them the tools that will best help them root out these terrorists and provide security within their own country. We believe in the early stages that surveillance to localize Boko Haram is the first step, but perhaps training and additional resources, if called for alongside our allies, would be the next step. Certainly, Mr. Speaker, I think our government has a number of programs, including the one he mentioned, that we support on a global basis, whether through the United Nations or on a bilateral basis with countries, to promote education. Because really, the terror here is not just the physical threat that groups like Boko Haram provide. They're actually trying to keep people repressed by taking education from them, especially young girls, Mr. Speaker, and that's particularly abhorrent.
Excuse me, questions and comments. Honourable Member for Etobicoke North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for this speech, and I hope he'll let the grade 7 and 8 children know how much we appreciate their caring. There have been reports that some of the girls have been forced into marriage with their abductors who have paid a nominal bride price of $12, we hear, and that some may have been carried across the borders into Cameroon and Chad. And I'm wondering whether the member can confirm whether these reports are correct or not, and what the consequences for any rescue operation might be, particularly if multiple jurisdictions are involved.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her passionate remarks here tonight and for this question. As I've mentioned, and I know my colleague from Newmarket Aurora also mentioned, Canada has strong leadership in our support for funding to end child and early forced marriage. While that relates in one way to what's going on here, really it's the terror of the kidnapping and the coercion involved in this case that needs to end, and really the perversion of a faith in the process that I tried to also address in my remarks, and how Canada can bring our respected approach to diversity and pluralism as we also go forward and talk about these important subjects. I think the challenge for this region and the challenge for civilized countries trying to address global terror networks, whether it's Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate, but is probably centered mainly in Nigeria, but is in Niger, Chad, Cameroon. We have to have a global response working with our allies, but also working with countries in the Maghreb and in Africa to make sure that there's a coordination, to make sure that they just don't go on to a failed state and regroup. We really have to have a coordinated global response. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.